We're officially recording.
Okay. Am I good?
You're good.
Okay.
I could introduce you, but I don't think you need it.
Yeah. All right. Well, for those on the internet, I'm Keith Midgett. I'm the first past president of Old Point Comfort Yacht Club. It's my pleasure today to give you a lecture that is a combination of geography, history, and a little family history thrown in. Next slide. I gave this lecture to the Yorktown Coast Guard training station about 5 or 6 years ago, and so you'll have to forgive me if I use my notes throughout because I've forgotten a lot of stuff. So we're going to start out talking about a little geography. The Gulf Stream, of course, everyone knows what the Gulf Stream is. It starts in the Caribbean, runs up the East Coast, up through Labrador, and then goes across and ends up in Norway and the above the British Isles. So that kind of centers why we have this lecture in a way. Next slide. So the Gulf Stream has been known to Europeans in the New World since about the 1500s, if not earlier, when the earlier explorers used the current to sail back to Europe. When you compare the chart shown here and the current maps of the Gulf Stream, it's uncanny how accurate it really was. And, if you go back in, look at the 1700s, I think it was Hamilton that coined the term Gulf Stream, but Benjamin Franklin was very interested in it and had a lot to say about it, and was very interested in. Of course, he was interested in a lot of things, but that was one of the things he was interested in. Next slide. So this is the Gulf Stream today. You can see it comes up, and this is North Carolina right here, the Outer Banks, and it closes. It can get within, depending on the sideways east-west side, it can get as close to about 10 miles to the coast. So, and it gets up to about 3 knots. So at its center, at Cape Hatteras, the banks jut out just far enough that the northbound Gulf Stream encounter the cold waters of the Labrador Current, which is here, countercurrent to the Gulf Stream. So obviously with two currents meeting in one area, that's going to cause a little bit of problems. The junction at Diamond Shoals, which is actually 14 miles into the Atlantic, is a point of constant turbulence, shifting shifting sandbars, and of course countless shipwrecks. The strong currents and hidden shoals can pound a ship to pieces in minutes. Talking about wooden ships, not necessarily the steel ships we have today. However, we'll talk about that in a while. The non-existence of natural landmarks along this low-lying flat coastline meant that ships had to draw dangerously close to shore to get a bearing. And there were, even in the 1700s, just a few lighthouses that they could knew where they actually were. And we'll talk about that as a problem. Strong offshore winds are created here as an ideal place for low and high pressure systems to meet. You throw in this equation and the occasional nor'easter, and you have a pretty bad situation for sailors. So David Stick writes in his book, I forgot to mention, the source of this lecture today are two of David Stick's books, Outer Banks, North Carolina, and more importantly, I think, The Graveyard of the Atlantic. And then I also pulled from a more recent book called Fire on the Beach by David Wright and David Zobe, which is about the Pea Island Station, which was actually the only all-black life-saving station on the Outer Banks. We're not going to talk about that today. That's topic of another one, another lecture. But at any rate, David Stick wrote, "You can stand on Cape Hatteras on a stormy day and watch two oceans come together in an awesome display of savage fury. For there at the point in the northbound Gulf Stream and the cold currents coming down from the Arctic run head on into each other, tossing their spumy spray 100 feet or better into the air and dropping sand and shells and sea life at the point of impact. Thus formed the dreaded Diamond Shoals, its fang-like shifting sand bars pushing seaward to snare an unwary mariner. Seafaring men call it the graveyard of the Atlantic." So, as we saw in the previous slide, northbound current of the Gulf Stream allowed ships to coast up the Atlantic seaboard on their way to Spain from the south. Southbound ships followed the colder southbound current of the Labrador coming down from the Arctic, and these made excellent mariner highways except for that little intervening place at Cape Hatteras. Even though the areas were well marked on charts, again, the shifting sands of Diamond Shoals and the strong offshore winds blew many ships close to shore and where they met their demise. Next slide, please. So with all of that turbulence, next slide. So with that, all the turbulence and the shifting sands and winds and hurricanes and nor'easters, a lot of the effect of that is to create a lot of inlets in the Outer Banks. And you can see from this slide that over time, since the 1500s, there are a lot more inlets than there are now. Some of which were around in the 1700s, 1800s, and have filled in more. We had recently up in the northern banks, I think where Topsail, I think it was near Caffey's, old Caffey's Inlet. We actually had a breach during I think last year, the year before, where it created a short-term inlet. It wasn't deep, and they filled it, and it's not an inlet anymore. But you can see that there was a heck of a lot of different than it is today in terms of inlets. Next slide. So I mentioned graveyard of the Atlantic. Here's a really good chart, and actually have, and since that's really hard to read, I'll pass this one around. This is the actual chart I've had sitting in my desk for 20 years. So throughout the 1500s, the English, Spanish, and French mariners sailed their vessels off the banks, charting inlets in dangerous waters and attempting colonization, of course. By the late 1600s, it was already known for shipwrecks. And in 1802, the first lighthouses were constructed along the banks. The first known shipwreck on the Outer Banks was that of a Spanish vessel in 1545. Since then, shipwrecks have been an important aspect of life on these islands. The miles of beaches and tall dunes were littered with shipwreckage, boxes, crates, barrels of merchandise, rum, whiskey, sugar, gold, silver, furniture, and the list went on. Occasionally, bodies of hapless sailors washed up on the beach. The salvagers or scavengers built small shacks, mostly on the mainland side of the islands, far away from the heavy surf and tidal overwash. There were plenty of building supplies such as timbers, lumbers, dunnage, and sail canvas from the shipwreckage to help protect them from the elements. What they couldn't use, they traded to the mainlanders for passing ships that frequented the small ports. Soon, small settlements appeared on the high ground as more people came to live to the islands, drawn by the lure of treasures on the beach. Now, this gets back to the lack of lighthouses. Some people say my family was involved in some of this, but they would take in 1799, Thomas Midgett, my direct ancestor, gave the land for Body Island Light. Well, so there was a light at Cape Hatteras in the 1750s, I think. And then you had Body Island in 1799. I think it was completed in 1802. and it was about midway, and then there was the Currituck light up further north. Well, there's a big distance between those. So if you were up on a high dune with a light on your horse, and you ran that horse up and down the dunes at night, it would look like a lighthouse. So the unwary mariner would think that would be either Body Island Light or Currituck Light, and knew that he could go into shore. Well, you go into shore, run aground, all of a sudden you're a shipwreck, and the people doing that would, it's kind of a self-licking ice cream cone. They would, actually cause the shipwreck that they did. Now, I'm not saying the midgets participated in that, but that's where Nag's Head came from. And Jockey's Ridge was from them putting a lantern on a nag, running it up and down the dunes up on Jockey's Ridge. And that's why they did it, was to bring unwary ships in closer to shore into the breakers, and then they could salvage the cargo. So anyway, the at that time, early on, the diet was mostly fish, shellfish, and waterfowl. They were all plentiful in the surrounding bays and inlets. At first, the cattle and pigs were scarce, but soon small herds they would free range along the banks, all up and down the banks. And so again, they supplemented their existence with salvage goods, what they took over to the mainland to barter for other stuff. And they really didn't have any need for money, since there weren't any stores, there weren't any cities on the banks, and very few on the mainland even. New Bern, Adenton, there wasn't much more than those two at that, and Bath, I guess, at that in the 1700s. So there really wasn't much need for money. So because of the isolation, the workers lived with their families in nearby hamlets. Again, not many people, not many families. A lot of intermarriage between the Midgetts, Meekins, Scarboroughs, Pharaohs, Pews. I think that's about all of them. Yeah, I think that's most of them. And they proliferated on the banks, and but they were pretty much farmers and fishermen. And they added waterfowl to that mix after the Civil War, because they had a way to get ducks. The ducks that they took, the market gunners would take them, and then what they call a buy boat would come down from Pamlico Sound all the way down, and the hunters would take what they shot, sell them to the buy boat, and then they would take the buy boat would go back to the railroad head in Coinjock, and they would ship all those ducks up to Norfolk and DC and New York, actually, where the restaurants would get them. So, and that was a big money maker. The other thing they started doing in the 1880s and all the way through to the 20s were duck clubs. Rich Yankees would come down, and the Midgetts and the Meekins and the Scarboroughs all had duck clubs all up and down the Outer Banks, and they would usually be the guides, and that provided an income from them in the winter months when they, couldn't fish necessarily, couldn't farm, so that provided an income for them during those days. And because of that, small villages began to spring up along the banks to support government activities such as building lighthouses, manning the light stations, weather stations, post offices, and they also ran supply boats back and forth to the mainland. And that's where the Hatteras design came from the boats that used to run from the Outer Banks to the mainland. They needed a fairly shallow draft vessel that could handle the high seas, both out and inside in the sounds, and that's where the Hatteras design came from. Next slide. Nope. There we go. So, give me a quick history, stuff in the early days, there wasn't much that happened on the Outer Banks, really. There was just not enough people and things that happened that to cause anything. So we're going to go through a little bit of history lesson here. Of course, the Lost Colony in Roanoke Island was there, and I think the latest research and archaeology says that they dispersed into the mainland and merged with some friendly Indian tribes, and so that's probably what happened to them. In 1635, the Midgetts arrived in Yorktown with the Meekins, the Daniels, and the Jarvis families, also prominent in North Carolina. Jarvis is governor of North Carolina at one point. Meekins, the Midgetts, Meekins, and Daniels are all intermingled throughout history, but they arrived on one ship. The Midgetts stayed in around Jamestown, James City County. John Midgett was probably a shipwright, and he probably was at the shipyard on Chickahominy River, which existed in the early colonial days. Then went to cross the James River to Hopewell, not Hopewell, no, shipyard there in Hopewell. And then they probably went to what was then a boom town called London Town, which is on the South River. And Matthew Midgett in 1696 had his own shipyard, had an apprentice for a shipyard, and married Judith White. And so from there, he had a little problem in 1694 to 1708 or so. Legal problems with sheep stealing, and got into a little tiff with I guess a neighbor. But he was found innocent of those things. But regardless, he moved down to North Carolina and arrived in Pasquotank County initially, and then moved to Durant's Island on the other side, the south side of the Sound, on the Alligator River in the White Oak area. No one knows exactly where he was, but from written records, that's what it indicated. He had a dispute with another guy on the island, and it's in the records, so we know he was there then. So the big event in North Carolina in 1709, 1710 was the Quaker Rebellion. And and that was I guess that's next slide. So there was called Quaker Rebellion. The Quakers, which had come in from Virginia actually, and they supported the previous governor. The new governor showed up. Governor Carey was reticent to be relieved as governor. He didn't feel like the Lords proprietors had properly appointed Governor Hyde. So there was a rebellion, and so Matthew Midgett, who supported Governor Hyde, took his ship, probably a shallow draft, 60-foot sloop, put a cannon on it, and bombarded the rebellious people supporting Carey in New Bern, and chased them off. Governor was very happy with that, so he granted him the entire length of the Outer Banks, some, I think it was 1900 acres. So So from that, he stayed on the mainland for a while, probably in 1719, 1720, actually moved to the area. He had 3 sons, 4 daughters. The 3 sons one stayed in the Upper Banks, one in the Middle Banks, and one in Hatteras. So from those 3 sons of his, they populated the length and breadth of the Outer Banks and Currituck County on the mainland, and then some of them went on to Tennessee, and they spread all over the place. Let's see. So, next slide. So again, Matthew Thomas was the one that stayed near Rodanthe and Body Island and Pea Island in that area. And so he gave the land to the federal government in 1799 to 1798. The lighthouse was started in 1799, finished in 1802. And unfortunately, he was lost at sea. And we think, based on his father making several trips to Venezuela, trading naval stores and lumber for goods in Venezuela, that he was coming back from Venezuela when he was lost at sea. So not much happened from 1798 until the war. And in August 1861, the Union forces took Fort Hatteras and Fort Clark that were guarding Hatteras Inlet. And then in October of 1861 were the Chickamacomico races, where Union forces left Hatteras, moved down to what's now Rodanthe, and actually they were using Ira midgets, my great grandfather's plantation, to their headquarters. And the Confederates that had a gunboat in Pamlico Sound, they also had forces that were coming from Roanoke Island up down the banks, and they chased the Yankees back to Fort Hatteras. And that's where the term came from, because they chased the Yankees down, and then the Yankees chased them back up. So it was a race to not get captured. And there's a really, really good, it's actually a, what do you call it, dissertation by a gent who did some really neat research on that battle, because he wanted to find out where, well, the Confederates were using Ira Midget's windmill to gauge where the Yankees were fortified. They had fortified, they put an embankment basically across what's now Route 12. So there was all across from the seaside to the shore side, or the sound side, there was a redoubt, and they were behind. They had a couple cannon, and so the Confederates were trying to bomb that. Well, on the seaside, there were 2 gunboats that the Yankees had, and they were doing the same thing when the Confederates took it over. So there were a bunch of cannonballs in the area. So he took a magnetometer on a boat and did a survey of the whole area around the sound, and figured out by the size of the shot, because he found a bunch of cannonballs, and figured out what they were targeting and where they came from. And it's a really, really interesting study. So anyway, that was the interesting thing, is that the Midgets supported both sides. They were Confederates when they started, and then they joined the Union because, the Outer Banks being separated from the mainland as they were, the populace was getting no support from the Confederate government at all, because they couldn't, because they didn't own, they had the sound sort of everything south of Rodanthe basically. And so they seceded again from the United States, and they seceded from the Confederate States of America, because they had to survive. And the Yankees had taken an occupation of the Outer Banks towards the end of the war. So
Something on the land side of the Outer Banks, or were they having to go out into the sea?
No, they were on the banks. And the Confederates had New Bern, still had the mainland. So they were trying to, they wanted to get access into the sound so they could get their gunboats in and then push up to Roanoke Island where there was a Fort Macon, I believe. So they wanted, that was their ultimate goal, was to take Roanoke Island, and then they could push into the mainland. And that's eventually what happened. So, so I mentioned earlier that when Matthew Midgett appeared on the Outer Banks in 1718, 1719, as a child, I was told that Matthew had arrived on a rum barrel from a shipwreck. And that tale existed probably until after I was probably in high school, or maybe when I was in college. That myth was finally dispelled. And some historians in the 50s also reasoned that he was a descendant of related to pirates, like maybe Edward Teach's crew, better known as Blackbeard, who terrorized the Outer Banks in the 1700s and had his headquarters in New Bern for a while. Both stories have been proven false, but it is no less interesting. There is some thought that I think it was 1712, and I didn't put it on this slide, but 1712, of course, Blackbeard and the Queen Anne's Revenge was his ship. Lieutenant Maynard came from Hampton Roads, and a British sloop, went in down the Pamlico Sound, through one of the sounds and into Pamlico Sound, attacked him, killed him, took the crew. They were all, what crew he still had, was beheaded, and the others were put in jail. And his head was put on at Blackbeard's Point here in Hampton on a pike as a reminder to what happens to pirates in that time. So that was an interesting thing. So after the war, again, not much happened. And after the war, there were a number of shipwrecks, high visibility shipwrecks, actually in the north, in Massachusetts, off Cape Cod, and in Maine. And that led to Congress creating the United States Life-Saving Service in 1871. And as they, got money and everything, and got organized, they moved the Life-Saving Service into North Carolina, Virginia, and North Carolina, and they started commissioning life-saving stations in the Outer Banks. So, in Chicmacomico, Captain Ban Midgett was appointed the keeper there. Etheridge I can't remember his first name. Captain Etheridge in the black one was in charge of Pea Island. Major development for the Outer Banks because it provided employment for the construction of the life-saving stations and a continued employment for the surfmen and the keepers of each life-saving station along the banks. And so that was a major development for the Outer Banks. Next slide. So from the 18, and I mentioned earlier about the duck hunting and stuff like that. Well, 1903, the Wright brothers thought it would be a great idea to come down to the Outer Banks because of the high winds they always have, to work on their aeroplane. And a midget, Captain Franklin Harris Midgett, my great uncle, I think, was the one that transported all the lumber and for their sheds and all their equipment, the engines for the airplane and all that, from Elizabeth City to Kitty Hawk. And both brothers stayed at his home during the construction of their workshops. And Midgett's had a big part to play in the creation, in the building and support of his their workshops as they tooled up and got ready to go. Now, in I think it was 1907 when they actually had their first flight. And I have no documentation to back it up, but I was told by an aunt or a great aunt of mine when I was young that there was a midget boy who frequented the Wright brothers workshop and was present during their first flight. If you remember that picture, the first flight picture, there's a young man in the foreground. That's not a midget. It's not a midget, but apparently there was a midget present there. And the fact that he had made friends with Franklin Harris Midget and the family, and they frequently stayed at his home, it probably was probable that one of the midget kids observed, if not the first flight, some of the earlier flights. So anyway, interesting. So in 1915, the Life Saving Service moved from the Coast Guard. Another midget appointed the keeper at Chickacomico, and also in that time frame is when they changed the name from Chickacomico to Rodanthe. World War I, the Merlot was sunk, and Captain John was involved in that. 1954 was decommissioned, and they created a Chickacomico Historical Association and took the buildings, the original buildings, and built what is there now. So I'll talk about a little bit. We'll see some more of that in a minute. Next slide. So these are all the stations up and down the coast. This is where Rodanthe is now in the Chickacomico area. Not a very, if you look at the banks, and of course it's different, a little bit different now because this slice of the banks is probably a mile, less than a mile wide. In fact, Buxton is probably going to have, if they have another, if this nor'easter is bad enough, we may have another inlet in either Rodanthe or Buxton. So anyway, just next slide. I think you went two. Did you go back? Should be two more slides. Okay, go back. Next slide. Maybe I cut that out. All right. So the regulations, Life Saving Service, 1899. So this is what they tasked them to do, and basically they tasked them to save lives. That was their purpose in life, and they gave them certain tools to help them do that: lifeboat, breeches buoy, Lyle's cannon. And we'll talk about all that stuff, the tools that they had to do their job, which is pretty interesting. So, they were, if there was a death on the banks and where there was a life-saving station, that keeper was probably going to be in trouble. So, next slide. And this is what they said. This is what the surfman always said. Said you got to go out. Don't say nothing about coming back. So that was and that was it. They knew they had to go out and try and rescue people if there was a ship foundering in the surf. Next slide. Here's Rodanthe today. This is the Chickacomico Life Saving Station. That's the boathouse. You can see now there's Route 12 there. Midget house is actually, or I guess this is it here. No, this is it here. But you can see that, well, in the old days, there wouldn't have been any of these because bankers put their houses on the sound side for good reason. This life-saving station had been moved a couple times. If it was in its original location in in 1874, it would be in the surf about right here. So really the only homes on the surf side were the life-saving stations and the lighthouse keeper stations until much later. Next slide. All right, this is the restored 1911 Chickamaucomico life-saving station. And so both it and the 1874 station have been restored. Both of them are open to the public. And it's pretty cool. During the summertime, they get volunteers, Coast Guard volunteers, to come out and do breeches buoy demonstrations. I'll show you a little bit about that in a minute. So it's a pretty cool place to go in the summertime. They have a Facebook page. You can see when those demonstrations are scheduled, but it's very interesting. So in 1874, I mentioned the first of 7 life-saving stations were constructed on the Outer Banks. This is the original life-saving station that's been restored to its original configuration. It was a 43-foot by 19-foot building, had a boat area on the first floor, living areas to accommodate the keeper and the crew on the second floor, and storage area on the third. This is probably the best preserved life-saving station in the country, although the Kitty Hawk station, where my grandfather was actually stationed at one time in 1928, is still intact. It was in use as part of the Black Pelican restaurant, and then it was moved to Crawla and is used as business. So you can go up to Crawla and see the old Kitty Hawk station, and it looks very, very similar with the same style of construction. It's a little bit smaller though.
Actually, one up in Cape Cod.
Yeah, and it's the same. Yeah, almost. They had their plan was they were all supposed to be the same, because each station had a keeper and 6 or 7 surfmen, and they stayed on task for like 4 days and then 3 days off, and that type of thing, on and off. Next slide. It's the boathouse I mentioned. And you can see that, well, good. So the main tool, yeah, I was going to say, you can see it kind of has that Victorian style architecture that Kimball Summer apparently liked the design. I can't remember who the architect was from up north, but they, did a good thing in consolidating, using one design for all the life-saving stations. It's kind of cool. Next slide. So the main tool of the life-saving service was the lifeboat, made to transit the most unimaginable waters that nature could conjure up, and to return through the same surf loaded with the storm's victims. These boats required a great deal of skill, keen knowledge of the breaking surf and its explosive power. The helmsman had to take advantage of the interval between combers and the relentless grit of the surfmen to continue rowing while beyond exhaustion were prerequisites to a crew even entering a surf boat. Manned by 6 surfmen and a helmsman, the helmsman is usually the keeper. The lifeboat was the bread and butter tool of the service. Surfmen were hired by the service, brawny local men who were known to handle an oar well. The midgets were those type of men, and they filled life-saving stations up and down the banks. Next one. And here's one. I think it was actually from up north. So they also had, next slide. They also used horses. Next slide. So they also used horses to assist with movement of beach apparatus equipment with a horse-drawn wagon. Interestingly enough, not all of the life-saving stations had horses. So if they didn't have horses, guess what? Those 6 guys, so surfmen, they had to carry that apparatus down the beach and then go rescue somebody. So you can imagine how tired they would be after carrying it down 3 or 4 miles down the beach, and then having to perform whatever rescue they had to do. So they had to be pretty hardy guys. Next slide. So this is the Lyle gun. It was invented by David A. Lyle. It's heavy, short barreled cannon that was used to throw a breeches buoy shot line to a stranded ship. It's capable of firing a line out to about 300 to 450 yards, used 8 ounces of black powder. The shot weighed 18 pounds, was a cylindrical projectile with an eye on one end where the line was tied. So they would bring that to the wreck site, position it facing the ship. The surfmen on shore would file the projector over the wreck, where the crew would then secure it to the mast or lines on deck. And then they would secure that rope, hawser, and then they'd rescue. A life car would be sent out, and they would put somebody in it, and then they would bring it back. And I've got some. So in 1891, through the use of the Lyle gun and breeches buoy, the Chickamaucomico crew was credited with saving 7 members of the Stratherly. And in 1898, the schooner Fessenden. And in 1899, the entire crew of the Minnie Bergen. Next slide. So I mentioned that the reenactment crews, this is the reenactment crew. And so the shot line is actually carried in the cart and is stored in this what they call a faking box. And it's basically the 450 foot of line, 500 feet of line that's faked down so that when it's shot, the line pays out properly and will make it to the ship. So if the wind direction allowed, the ship was aground within 500 yards of shore, they would use the breeches buoy. They'd bury the sand anchor, position and sight the Lyle gun, ready the faking box, and so that it would pay out smoothly. And if it was successful in the first shot, the crew would begin the process of establishing the heavier lines for the rescue. If it fouled or the projectile was poorly aimed, they'd have to do it again. So they may have to do it 3 or 4 times. And if it was in freezing, wet lines, and during a hurricane, you can imagine how difficult that might be. Next slide. So this is what the idea is, that you'd shoot that Lyle gun out into the rigging. The crew on the ship would secure it, and then using a messenger line, they would take the breeches buoy along that to shoreline. And I kind of equate it to an underway replenishment in our modern day Navy. Same idea. You shoot a messenger over, take the hawser over, connect it to the ship you're going to unrep with, and bring that back and going back and forth. Same idea. And as we don't do, this is actually we call a high line transfer, where you're transferring a person. We don't do that very often anymore. I don't know. I don't think they even allow it anymore, but we did it as first lieutenant on my first ship. I got dunked by my bosun mates. That was one of the things you did. Yeah. Next slide. So one of the things, because there was not a lot to do on the Outer Banks in whatever time of year you might say, they did like any military organization would do. They drilled, and they regularly practiced at each station a weekly drill, and that they had to practice to make sure they knew what they had to do when that time came. Crews that did not perform the drill in adequate time faced dismissal from the service. The drill demonstrated the equipment used, the duties of each surfman, and the skill and stamina demanded of them, and they did a lot of that. Next slide. This is the Chickamaucomico crew practicing a breeches buoy drill in 1933. It's John Allen Midgett and the keeper in the foreground. And next slide. This is an actual picture of a breeches buoy rescue in 1925 with the Chickamaucomico and Gull Shoal Station crew in 1925, when the G.A. Kohler stranded in August 23rd, 1933 hurricane. All 8 crewmen and 1 woman were rescued, but you can see how close to the shore She ran up before they got to her. And next slide. And that's how after the storm, you can see people were standing right next to her. So it didn't take long for her to ground really hard. So the Kohler at that time was one of the last large sailing ships still in service. And she remained stranded on the beach until early in World War II when she was burned for her scrap iron content. But her bottom timbers are still visible at low tide. If you go down to the Rodanthe area, you can still see it. They have a sign for it. So next slide. So this gaunt gentleman was Captain Bannister Midgett, the patriarch of the life-saving service midgets. He was born in Rodanthe in May 30th, 1852. Married Sabrina Midgett, sister of John Allen Midgett. I mentioned that there weren't very many opportunities for romance in those days, so first cousin, okay. He was the first keeper of Life Saving Station number 18 in 1879, having been a surfman in number 20 from 1877 to 1878. And he retired in 1 year after the Life Saving Service and Coast Guard merged, and having been keeper of Chickamaucomico Station since its construction. As I understand, he was not a fan of the merger between the Life Saving Station and the Coast Guard. I can't remember what he said, but it was words to the effect that a marriage made in hell or something like that. Next slide. This is Israel B. Midgett, who was the number 1 surfman. And the way that kind of worked was you worked your way from a number 6 surfman or number 7 surfman, if your station had one, all the way up as you gained in seniority. So Israel was a senior surfman at Chickamaucomico Station from 1879 to 1881. And then he was the keeper of the lighthouse at Gulf Shoals from 1882 to 1889. So he was the father-in-law of Zion Scarborough Midgett, who married Lucretia Wahab Midgett. Wahab is another Outer Banks name. And she's here in the right-hand side. So life-saving service on the Outer Banks was a family business and very parochial. Next slide. So this is John Allen and Colinda Payne. He was a kind of a not just in the fact that he was a keeper and well known because of his exploits as a Coast Guardsman, but he was a patriarch for Rodanthe. And if they didn't have a mayor, but if there was a mayor, he would have been the mayor of Chickamaucomico or Rodanthe during his years. And just for a little fun, I threw in a couple other midgets. Next slide. This is Nelson Midgett. If I had a pipe in my mouth, you could kind of see the family resemblance. That's him as a young man. That's him as right as he retired. Next slide. Levine Midgett is another great uncle of mine. We're going to talk about one of the shipwrecks that he was involved in a few minutes. But he had a lengthy tour of service, as you can see by his slashes. He did about 30 years in service. Next slide. A little closer to home, my grandfather, William Van Buren Midgett, Sr., and Rasmus Midgett, who we'll talk about in a minute, and John Allen Midgett were both uncles to my grandfather, who served as a surfman at Chickamaucomico Station in 1924, then Kitty Hawk until 1927. And then he was sent to school and then went to Pigeon Cove Station in Boston District in Massachusetts after having training in patrol boats in Connecticut. And when he got back to Pigeon Cove, he participated in some really hairy, heavy sea rescues. One of which some people say was the real life version of the movie that what's his name? The Storm. Yeah, Perfect Storm. So that they participated in that, and that was the genesis of. There were some news articles. It was talked about, and supposedly that's on the Coast Guard side was his lifeboat was participating in that Perfect Storm thing, and that was in 1934, I believe. So anyway, both my dad and myself succumbed to the lure of the sky and wanted to be pilots, vice or ingrained love of the sea. My dad served in the Army Air Corps and in Italy with the 94th Pursuit Squadron in P-38s. And of course, I joined the Navy. And after flirting with danger as a student naval aviator and aspiring jet pilot, the Navy suggested for the betterment of the service an extension of what might otherwise have been a short life, that I should pursue a career with my feet planted firmly on the deck of a ship at sea. So I went to Navy and thought about switching to Coast Guard, but didn't. So my my direct family's connection with the Coast Guard ended with my grandfather, but there are many cousins, uncles, cousins that were midgets who served and continue to serve in the Coast Guard. So next slide. Rasmus S. Midgett. The focus really should have been the focus of this discussion because it's the most unique rescue of all time. So Erasmus Sanders Midgett was born to little Nicodemus and Afrika S. Meekins, my great-great-great-grandparents, on 9 June 1869 in Rodanthe. His father was a fisherman, as was his grandfather. As he grew up on the banks, he was a competent sailor and oarsman. He was hired on as a surfman in the Gold Shoal Station, where he served for many years. He was responsible for perhaps the most historic rescue in all of the history of the Coast Guard, the life-saving service and the Coast Guard. Next slide. So surfmen were assigned to cover the beach between there and the next life-saving station. Their duty was to meet up with the patrol from a neighboring station and exchange checks or small metal badges, like a little brass badge with a number on it. And they had to exchange them to prove that they had completed their rounds. If a wreck was sighted, the patrol would illuminate a Coston flare, which you see here, which would be spotted by the crewman standing on watch in the station's observation tower. Then swiftly the crew would determine if the rescue would be affected by surf boat or breeches buoy, and then the work would begin. So Rasmus Midgett of the Gull Island Station was probably dressed in his oilskins, as you see here. They didn't have any fancy foul weather gear at their time. It was all oilskin, canvas oilskin, probably waterproofed with mink oil maybe, or oil, but they were pretty nasty, I think. So anyway, and he had his lantern with him on the early days of August 1889. So that was interesting. Next slide. Because in 1899 was one of the most powerful hurricanes to ever go past the East Coast. And so to set the stage, the report of the Weather Bureau station at Hatteras said that on the morning of the 16th, the wind reached a velocity of 50 miles an hour, increasing thereafter until about 4 o'clock. On the morning of the 17th, it was blowing at 70 miles an hour. By noon, it increased to 84 to 93. And at 1 o'clock, an occasional extreme of more than 120 miles an hour were recorded. The signal station was disabled about that time, but the observer states he believes the regular movement of the wind was not less than 100 miles an hour between 3 and 7 o'clock that day. Next slide. So, same time, the Priscilla, American vessel of 643 tons, commanded by Captain Benjamin Springsteen from Baltimore, and was bound to Rio de Janeiro, laden with general cargo. It had 14 people on board, 12 of whom comprised the officers and crew, the captain's wife, Virginia, and his young son, Elmer, who was 12. They left Baltimore on Saturday the 12th and were towed down to Chesapeake Bay as far as the James River Channel, where they came to anchor and remained until Monday, August 14th, when they were told that it should be okay. They proceeded to sea, passing out the Capes of Virginia at 6 a.m., standing east under all sail, the wind being moderate from west-northwest, hauling to the northward. At noon, Cape Henry was 30 miles west. At midnight, the breeze was very light, barometer high, registering 3.20 inches, and the weather was clear. By Tuesday morning, wind had shifted to the northeast, the sky was cloudy, and the conditions remained unchanged until midnight, when the breeze hauled east-northeast and increased so much that the sky sails and jib topsail were taken in. Morning of Wednesday, the wind was blowing so hard that all the light sails were taken in. By noonday, they furled the spanker and the upper topsails. The gale became more violent. The foresail was hauled in. The lower topsail clewed, but it blew away, and 2 reefs put into the mainsail, which were also lost, as well as the main staysail. The captain hove to under bare poles, heading southeast in an east-northeast tempest, and rapidly drifted to the south-southwest. He knew he had to get past Cape Hatteras, and he was doing his best to clear it, but he knew he didn't have any hope because he hadn't passed any of the lights at that point. So early on the 17th, he observed the water was discolored, and that showed that he had drifted out of the Gulf Stream, and throwing in the lead at 5 o'clock found that he only had 30 fathoms of water. At 6 o'clock, it was 25, and at 8 o'clock, 20. And at 1 hour intervals, there were soundings until 8 o'clock p.m. when it was down to 10. And he knew that they were going to run aground, and told that all hands to prepare to save themselves. So that was about the same time that the Weather Bureau said the hurricane hit about 100 miles an hour. 10 minutes past 9, the vessel struck bottom, and at first, and then skipped the sea, which smashed the cabin skylights and deluging all below. She didn't touch again for about 20 minutes, but then struck an awful shock and continued to pound so heavily that the master sent the mate and second mate forward with orders to cut away the port rigging. The 3 masts instantly went overboard, and the captain then ordered all hands on deck. The seas were breaking over the hull with irresistible fury, and in a few minutes, Mrs. Springsteen, William Springsteen, the mate, and the ship's boy, Fitzhugh Goldsborough, was swept overboard beyond the remotest possibility of aid. The boy Elmer, who was actually torn from his father's arms, was in some way dashed back into the cabin, where his body was subsequently found later. So at 3 o'clock, Surfman Rasmus Midgett set out on horseback. Interesting that he had a horse on that day, to make regular south patrol, and then he reached the point about 3/4 of a mile from the station. He discovered buckets, barrels, boxes, and other articles coming ashore, with satisfied him that there was a wreck somewhere in the neighborhood. So he'd only been about 2 miles. Well, he went another 2 miles, and then he heard the sound of voices and heard the cries of the shipwrecked men. Couldn't see him in the wreck, and couldn't see him because of the time of day and the seas. But he went towards the sea, made out part of the vessel, saw what was going on, and then he knew he had a decision. He could go back to the station and get everybody, or he could undertake to save the lives of the crews without any aid, and do it himself. Well, didn't think about it very much, and in the water he went. So he ran down as close to the wreck as he could and shouted instructions for the men to jump overboard one at a time as the surf ran back, and then he would grab them and bring them ashore. So he did that he rescued 7 men in that way. So he, you know, when the swell came out, you know, went back, they would jump in, swim into him, he'd grab them, cart them up on the beach where they were safe, and then go back and get another one. So he did that 7 times. And then the last, let's see, the last of the crew, he actually went on board, got them, and then swam them from the ship into the beach. And at that time, the other people from the Gold Shoal Station came down and joined them and helped get the crew members back to the life-saving station, where they, you know, they dressed their wounds, clothed them in dry garments, and then put them to bed. And so based on that, he was subsequently ordered a gold life-saving medal that, on October 18th, 1899 by the Secretary of the Treasury. And so, next slide. So that's him bringing one of the crewmen ashore, and that's probably a good representation of how far off the bark was when he went out to get it. Next slide. And this is the wreck of the Priscilla, just a couple days afterwards. And this is Rasmus Midgett sitting on the bow section. Next slide. And this is his daughter with the life-saving medal. And unfortunately, there were 13 bronze copies made of the life-saving medal that were given out to family. I have one of those 13, and unfortunately, it's still packed up. So we just had the house painted inside and out, and it's still packed up somewhere. I couldn't figure out what box it was in, so I didn't bring it, unfortunately. Next slide.
That's the original one.
Rasmus's great-grandson has it now. So, the lifesavers of the U.S. Life-Saving Service were known as surfmen, were also called heroes of the storm or storm warriors. The real life of the surfman was a frustrating combination of long stretches of boredom, loneliness, and routine interspersed with bursts of extreme terror. They were insupportably low wages and no retirement benefits. Their lives revolved around drills, preparing for readiness in the event of danger. Their daily routine included rowing, capsize drills, working with signal flags, swift deployment of breeches buoy apparatus, and the basic housekeeping of the station. Typically, 8 men were assigned to a station, a keeper and his crew, and depending on rank, surfman, number 1 to 7, depending on seniority. The designation also indicated duties during the boat and breeches buoy drills, in particular their living conditions, such as seating arrangement at the dinner table. During the months of the year that stations were manned, a constant lookout patrolled the beaches near the stations. Their duty, as I mentioned before, being to meet up with the patrol from a neighboring station and to exchange checks to prove that they had completed their rounds. Again, if a wreck was sighted, the patrol would illuminate a Coston flare, which would be spotted by the crewmen standing watch in the observation tower. Then they would, again, determine what they're going to do from there. So from there, let's go to World War I. Next slide. So this is the tanker, the British tanker Merlot, that was traveling up the coast. And it was torpedoed by U-117 off Hatteras Island. It was a 6,900-ton vessel, crew of 51. And they had taken a full cargo of oil in New Orleans, and the Merlot's master, William Roos Williams, was a veteran of many years on the bridge. He'd cast off on August 10th headed down the Mississippi into the Gulf of Mexico, rounded the Florida Keys, and started up the East Coast towards New York. This was during the absence of Diamond Shoals lightship, which had been sunk by U-140 on August 6th. So she passed Cape Hatteras far enough out that it was safe, and held a parallel course to Hatteras Island. So when they were opposite Wimble Shoal light buoy, torpedo struck the ship, and it started to burn. And also the explosion was so bad that it wrecked the engine room and put the lights and wireless out of commission. So they had no way to communicate with the shore. Captain Williams ordered the life rafts made ready for lowering and attempted to beach the ship. So surfman number 8, Leroy Midgett, had the watch in the lookout, and he had the 6 to 6 watch, and he saw the about 2 o'clock, saw the steamer pass, and knew it was on the run. So he saw the white cloud that was the torpedoed ship, and notified the crew, and and that they actually had another explosion, and they called John Midgett and told him that the ship had been torpedoed. So they called out all hands, and including the men that were at their house on Liberty, and they harnessed the team up, ran the life raft down to it was actually surf boat number 1046, and they lifted the boat off the cradle and into the sea, and there were villagers in Hatteras who had joined to help Captain John and his people shove off, but the sea was so rough the surf boat filled with gunnels, and they had to return to the beach. And so after they had drained it, they launched it again, and so they finally, on the third attempt, they made it through the surf. They got to again. This was under oar, but they had an engine at that time. This was later in World War II, so they had engines by that time. But so they started the engine and got through the breakers, and I think it was at 5 o'clock when they arrived. And they got another boat, and they found a boat that had 14 sailors in it, and they had another lifeboat that got underway with a full boat. So they got both of those boats clear of the fire that the oil and everything had caught fire around the ship, and they got them clear of it, and they got them all clear, and they were about 5 miles offshore at that point. So he gave that. There was another life boat that came out, a system. Those 2 life rafts from the ship they gave to that other one, and Captain John went in, saw an area where there wasn't any fire close to the vessel, so they went in there and got survivors on one of the lifeboats that had capsized, and they got those on board. So barrels of gasoline aboard the ship were exploding, and as each detonated, sheets of flame flared at least 100 feet in the air. The surface of the ocean between the surf boat and the bow was covered by burning gasoline and oil, while a great pillar of black smoke rolled upwards. As the craft approached the sinking ship, Leroy Midgett thought he glimpsed the U-boat's periscope. So, at any rate, they got, let's see, how many did they get on this one? they got most of the crew that were in the water. They got almost all of them. So, and they worked throughout the night, make sure that they got everybody. And let's see, 36 survivors, and they had another 6 that had been pulled from the sea as well. So, of the 51 crew, they got 40 some men. Next slide. And that's John Allen Midgett. And again, actually, because it was a British vessel, the British government awarded the gold life-saving medals for his Captain John, Zion, Arthur, Proteus, Clarence, and Leroy Midgett. And then they got the gold life-saving award as well. Next slide. So this is the actual surf boat number 1046 that was used in the Merlot rescue. And again, it's also in the boathouse at the Chickamaucomico station. I think it's 26 foot. 26. Yeah, like a standard Navy. Yeah. Yeah. So next slide. So a little closer to home. This is the Anna May, which is a fishing trawler out of Hampton. Captain J.E. Carmine was the captain, and it sunk in December of 1931 off Diamond Shoals. What's interesting about this is that in addition to J.E. Carmine Sr., his brother J.E. Carmine Jr., his brother-in-law, Rideout Lewis, who happens to be my uncle, and M.R. Johnson. And they were trawling down in off Diamond Shoals, and the engine died. They got swamped, filled with water, and settled on the shore, leaving only the mast above the breakers. And of course, they didn't have foul weather gear. They didn't have distress signals. They didn't have life jackets. So what ended up happening is Joseph Carmine Sr. ended up towards the end of this rescue taking his son and my uncle and tying them to the mast. And so this happened in the afternoon, about 2:00 in the afternoon. And and it was misty, kind of a foggy mist, so you couldn't see them. So they sat there pretty much all night, and the mast was still standing the next morning. And Keeper B.R. Balance, the Cape Hatteras station, launched a surf boat, and the crew of Hatteras Inlet Station, Keeper Levin Midgett, who you saw a picture of earlier, boarded their power boat and moved through the inlet and got out there and rescued Captain Carmine and his 4 crewmen when they were pretty much given up. They were soaked, frozen to death by the December cold, and they were pretty sure they were never going to be rescued. But both of them got through the breakers, and Midgett said that he came down once between 2 giant waves striking the bare sand. So, the breakers were pretty big. You got deep water going to a shoal. That's going to pretty big waves at that point. So anyway, they picked everybody up, and of course I grew up with the Carmines and Rideout Lewis, who ended up being chief of detectives for the Hampton Police Department for many years. One more shipwreck. I think it's the last one. That's not necessarily one that you would think about being off the Outer Banks, but it kind of is. And it's an interesting wreck, so I'll talk about it. So anyway, you had the replica of the Bounty, and it was used in the movie. On October 25th of 2012, it left New London, Connecticut, heading for St. Petersburg, and was on an easterly course to avoid Hurricane Sandy. It was about 113 miles southeast of the Outer Banks when it's in the vicinity called the Hatteras Canyon when they ran into trouble. Next slide. So there's their track. You can see what their idea was probably a good one if the hurricane had gone closer to Cape Hatteras. Unfortunately for them, it didn't. And so next slide. So you can see they're in not a good position for a sailing ship or any ship of any description to go into that area in a really, really bad hurricane. It's probably not a good thing. And as you can imagine, the effect of the hurricane, plus the fact that they had bilge pumps that weren't working, even their emergency pumps stopped working at the end. Next slide. That's what happened. They were so far out that the Coast Guard, it was too far out for the Coast Guard ships to get to them. They sent out C-130s, dropped life rafts and stuff for them. The captain, I think one other crew died. The rest of the crew was recovered. Next slide. So don't think that just because we've got all these modern technology and wind and weather forecasts and everything, shipwrecks on the Outer Banks are still happening today. These are not today, but they're fairly recent. Last 3 or 4 years, and even though 3 and 4 masted sailing ships don't trade up and down the banks as they they used to. Here are a couple of recent ones. The last picture I saw of this fishing vessel, it was covered by sand except for the mast. That's the only thing left. It's on the beach just south of Rodanthe. And of course, I'm sure it had been pit clean, and same thing for the sailing vessels. They were, by the time I think this one, if I remember correctly, this was a gentleman that had left Hampton, was heading to Florida, single-handing, and he just got too close, had a rudder problem, and ended up on the banks, and he finally got towed off finally, but this one, as I recall, did not. They just left it there. So you can still see that in the low tide, you can still see the mast of that one. Can't remember the names. I should have put those down. Next slide. So the Coast Guard has honored the Midgett family, in particular John Allen Midgett, by 2 ships, the Hamilton class high endurance cutter Midgett, and it was commissioned in 1972. When they did the commissioning, they did it in Manio, and had on the bow, there's a picture that National Geographic took of all the Midgett family on the bow of the ship. It's pretty cool. I should have put that picture in here. But anyway, they and actually as a commander on the West Coast, that's what the ship was stationed at Everett, Washington, and I had the occasion to do a cruise missile call on a destroyer that was moored forward of it. So I called the ship and said, "Hey, I'd like to come over and get a tour with my namesake." And the chief that I talked to said, "Who are you?" And I told him who I was. "Oh, yes, sir. I'll, no problem. I'll have somebody, take you around." So I did, and it was interesting. I I had a bosun mate seaman give me the tour, and he was in charge of the paint locker up forward. And boy, I tell you what, he was proud of that paint locker. My God, it was awesome. I had a ball. He went up to, just outside the boardroom and goes, "Sir, this is where the wardroom is." I said, "I don't go in there." I went, "What do you mean you don't go in there?" He goes, "Sir, that's where the officers are. I don't go in there." I went, "Oh, So anyway, it was a really fun tour. I called the captain. Yeah. Oh yeah. There was It was funny. So anyway, and so that ship was decommissioned in 2020 and given to another country, and I can't remember which country. It was one of the Caribbean countries, I believe. And then they commissioned the Legend class national security cutter Midgett that also holds the name Midgett. So anyway, I thought that was interesting if you didn't know about that. And now I'll take any questions. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming tonight. Yeah. What's the next lecture?
Yeah,
The 7th is Noah, right?
no.
Yeah.
I gotta come there. Working on it.
We do have 2 people on the Zoom meeting. We have Sandra and Jewel who've been on.
Oh, cool.
Hi, Sandra. Any questions from internet land?
None here, but thank you.
Okay. Well, if you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of me.
They can hear me, they can do it in the chat. I'm not sure if we can hear them on this one.
Yeah. So in.
Do you have another presentation you can pull up? Any more Midgett stories or otherwise?
No, not right now. That was it. That was it.
We'll get more for the 14th. And then we have the Temple bottom paint people that were supposed
Bottom
to be here
paint?
today. They're rescheduled to the 21st.
Okay, 21st is the bottom paint lecture.
I'm
And-
interested in the Noah one.
Yeah, the
Hopefully
Noah
that'll
one.
happen. We don't
Yeah.
have another storm.
Right, yeah, exactly. Hopefully, yeah, so everyone in internet land, I was not originally scheduled to do this lecture. Noah was supposed to come and give us a weather lecture. And of course, with the storm last week and the one this weekend, they had higher priorities at their office, so understood. So,
And we're gonna try to do better with communication.
Don't we normally get any Zoom participation showing up on the
you
side?
can,
I have it on.
yeah,
mine.
it's on his, yeah.
But Jewel had no questions, a great presentation, so thank you, Jewel.
Yeah, thank you very much. I
Apparently
appreciate
the,
that.
got the Zoom, though.
Yeah, good,
So
good.
that's-
All right, well, thank you very much. We'll see you next week.
Thank you, appreciate your time.
What's next week? Snow or no snow? Good. But they're the ones that canceled because they said they had to work. I mean, they did. They probably thought they had to work this weekend too. The car's covered in snow. Oh, no, that's just the white paint.
I had a teacher who said, you should do that. Just me, just a glare on it. He said, oh, that's the picture of Mike. He looks across, get a field. That's a bino car, marshmallow and a snowstorm.